queuing all the way over there. Hello, I'm John Barron.
I'm Shazza Chidala.
And welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat, wrapping up this week's Democratic National Convention.
We're also going to update you on the polls, the COVID pandemic, and as Kamala Harris becomes the Democrats' vice presidential nominee, I'll be going to the wall to look at elections and black women.
And I'll be trying to figure out exactly how to say Kamala and have a chat about the campaign ahead with the former chairman of the DNC, Howard Dean. Earlier today, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. came a step closer to fulfilling his childhood dream of becoming President of the United States when, after almost 50 years on the political stage, the 77-year-old former Vice President formally accepted the Democratic Party's nomination at the third attempt, never once in his speech mentioning his rival by name.
Our current president has failed in his most basic duty to the nation. He's failed to protect us. He's failed to protect America. And my fellow Americans, that is unforgivable. As president, I'll make you a promise. I'll protect America. I will defend us from every attack, seen and unseen, always, without exception, every time.
It was a speech, Chaz, that had to be tempered back somewhat because there was hardly any live audience there in Delaware to hear it. It wasn't quite as intimate as some of the speeches we saw earlier in the week, which were more sort of fireside chat-like, but how do you think he went?
Look, it's very workmanlike. He's not a great speaker, but he's not meant to be. The whole convention for 4 days was about how he's your mate. He's the everyman. You don't expect the everyman to speak like Barack Obama. And really, as the challenger to the incumbent, it's not his job necessarily to dazzle you. He's got a really easy job actually at the moment, and that is just to make the case against the president. For example,
no rhetoric is needed. Just judge this president on the facts. 5 million Americans infected by COVID-19. More than 170,000 Americans have died. By far the worst performance of any nation on earth. More than 50 million people have filed for unemployment this year. More than 10 million people are going to lose their health insurance this year. Nearly 1 in 6 small businesses have closed this year.
It's the easiest job in the world to be a challenger at a time like this. He just needs to recite those facts over and over again all the way to the election, and he did it.
It wasn't as though it was a speech entirely without rhetoric. Certainly earlier on, he loosened up, he became less formal as he went along, and he became more and more passionate as he went along. In the early phases, it reminded me of the Joe Biden of 1987, his first presidential campaign, when he was clearly, you could tell he'd been rehearsing in the mirror trying to sound like JFK. There was a certain Kennedy-esque cadence that was still peeking through today. And it had me in mind, Chaz, of the fact that there is a kind of a poignancy, even a pathos to the fact that Joe Biden now has taken this second last step towards the presidency of the United States. Who knows what happens in the next 2.5 months, whether he makes it all the way or not. Yet, strangely, this young man in a hurry in his early 40s in 1987, when his campaign fell apart and he went back to the Senate, he came back in 2008 with an uninspiring campaign that again was out of step with the age. It seemed like a final hurrah for him. Then Barack Obama gave him this lifeline, the vice presidency. And in 2016, Biden had decided it wasn't right for him to run. Hillary Clinton was too strong. He was too heartbroken over the death of his son, Beau Biden, of cancer in 2015. And yet he has constructed this narrative as to why he's putting on the helmet and the pads. One more time, he's trotting out onto the field, even when he's clearly been beaten and bruised and knocked about by life. He's not the man he once was. And yet there is almost, for the first time in Joe Biden's, he's been wanting to be president since Eisenhower was president. For the first time, there is now an answer to the question of why you, Joe Biden? Why you apart from everybody else? It seems that, at least for now, Biden's empathy and his character has met the moment, at least enough to get the nomination, if not the presidency in November.
Yeah, they're selling him as the last decent guy who's got one more campaign in him. He's the Danny Glover of Lethal Weapon for politics.
I'm getting too old for this kind of thing.
That's right. Yeah, actually on that note, I would say that I actually think the most powerful moment of his speech was conjured up by something that wasn't in his speech.
What was that?
Which was something that occurred almost directly before the big wind-up to his speech, when they got the family out and everything. Just before then, they had this 3-minute clip of a kid who stutters. And I want to play you a bit of that, just to get the vibe of what we're talking about. Given that Joe Biden himself defeated a stutter.
He told me that we were members of the same club. We stutter. It was really amazing to hear that someone like me became vice president. He told me about a book of poems by Yeats he would read out loud to practice. He showed me how he marks his addresses to make them easier to say out loud. So I did the same thing today.
Now, to me, there are so few memorable moments in these conventions. Maybe it's just because I had a stutter when I was a kid, but I am not going to forget that.
Yeah.
That kid was struggling so hard, and you could tell that he wasn't doing it because he was put there. He wanted to say something nice about Joe Biden. They were showing photos of Joe Biden coaching him, and they had 5, 6 maybe, different photos with different clothes. It suggested Joe Biden has spent a significant amount of time with this kid. And this whole time they've been selling the empathy that Joe's got real heart. Joe really cares about all of us. And that was the embodiment of it. And not only was it the embodiment of it, and you really felt for that kid and you felt that Joe cared, but on top of that, it actually turns his weakness into a strength, because his weakness is his lack of fluency.
Yeah.
The fact he stumbles. Now, they say it's always because it's a stutter. I don't think it's always because it's a stutter, but now every time he stumbles, you're thinking, that's the stutter.
Yeah.
And it happened during the speech. About 4 or 5 times he stumbled, and every time I thought, that's the stutter.
Yes.
And it reminded you instantly of that kid, of that kid who really cared for him.
Yeah, there are 2 things I'd say. I think you're right about that. I think it's, on the one hand, it's a very clever tactical move to, instead of having people see every time Biden hesitates thinking, oh, maybe that dementia stuff is real, maybe he can't string a sentence together, to actually remind people this is a guy who overcame a stutter. And it wasn't just that kid that he has mentored, literally dozens of kids over the years Biden has mentored in that way. The other thing as well, going back to the Biden's earlier attempts at the White House, Joe Biden didn't talk about his stutter in 1987. He didn't talk about it in 2008. In fact, we'll dig out a clip from 1987. We've played it before. It's the famous one where Biden is showing really Biden at his worst when he gets really angry at a voter in Iowa, Frank, poor old Frank. And this is really kind of key to Joe Biden, I think, that gives us an insight into his character. As a result of the stutter, he grew up being told he was stupid. And so he's always had this defensiveness that has come out if people have questioned his intellect. And at times it has made him look, unfortunately, very arrogant, and it's worked against him. But he's managed to turn it into his favour now. But this is the clip from 1987.
Question: what law school did you attend, and where did you place in that class? And the other question is, could you quickly, I think we all
I think I
Ronald
probably have a
Reagan.
much higher IQ than you do, I suspect. I went to law school on a full academic scholarship, the only one in my class to have a full academic scholarship, and I'd be delighted to sit down and compare my IQ to yours if you'd like, Frank.
Now, it's not as though we haven't seen a few little flashes of Biden's ego and defensiveness about questions of his intellect and so on. And that may well be something that Trump continues to chip away at.
Well, Trump does talk about Joe Biden being stupid.
Yeah, and so he's seen that that is a weak spot. But the problem for Donald Trump in Joe Biden delivering this speech, and it was only 24, 25 minutes, very, very short for these speeches, which, Bill Clinton's giving one of these speeches, it goes well over an hour. Yes, there was no applause in this, haven't seen a word count yet, but Biden was able to deliver it. He finished it. Yeah, he had a couple of little pauses as he was going for a word, but there was no sort of oops, awkward moments at all. And unfortunately, it rather destroys this narrative that people around Trump and Trump himself have been trying to deliver, that Biden's not all there. Now they'll pivot and they'll say, oh well, he can read an auto cue, anybody can do that. However, it still undermines that attack line.
I think it undermines it, but the gaffes aren't going away.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Biden will keep on churning them out. I don't think that attack is going to go away, but I do think they couldn't have inoculated him better against that attack than they did with that kid.
Yeah. Well, let's look at some of the other memorable moments that we've seen this week. We covered the first 2 days on Planet America on Wednesday night. You can find that on iView. Yesterday's lineup, though, a lot of heavy hitters, including 2016 nominee Hillary Clinton, who echoed Michelle Obama's theme from day one that was basically, we hope that Trump would be okay, that he'd rise to the job, but he's just not up to the task. Take a look.
I wish Donald Trump knew how to be a president, because America needs a president right now.
And then she had this warning against complacency and even skullduggery.
Don't forget, Joe and Kamala can win by 3 million votes and still lose. Take it from me. So we need numbers overwhelming so Trump can't sneak or steal his way to victory.
I've got to say, I hate the way Democrats and Hillary Clinton in particular keep on using the phrase steal the election. They talk about it 4 years ago, they talk about it now, and the fact is, 4 years ago, yes, Russia got up to all kinds of mischief. That is true. But Donald Trump himself, there is no evidence that he stole the election. And the reason I'm making such a big deal about this is because even as we speak, they are criticising Donald Trump for undermining the next election with mail-in voting and saying, oh, he's not going to accept the result, he's going to try and steal that. Okay, so if you're criticising Donald Trump for undermining elections, then you shouldn't undermine elections. Either this one or the last one 4 years ago, they're still going on about it. Can we all please stop undermining elections, all sides? Wouldn't that be great?
Well, it's a pious hope, of course. It's not going to happen. And you can see where Democrats, essentially what they're trying to say is, whether they're relitigating 2016 or not, when they look at what's happened with the postal system and looked at the fact that Donald Trump is not giving additional money to the states to conduct a largely mail-in election, they are concerned that there's going to be a amount of complacency, there's going to be a amount of people being demotivated. If it's another low turnout election in 2020 like it was in 2016, Donald Trump has a pretty good chance of winning. So they're wanting people to get out and vote, which is why they use that kind of rhetoric of stealing elections and, you know, sneaking this and everything else. It's it's the same as the voter ID debates we see every 4 years as well. It's all about motivating people, because if we don't get out and vote, they'll take it away from us.
That's fine, but just this is happening in a context where no one trusts elections anymore. And I think it would behove our politicians to be aware of that context.
All right. President Barack Obama also spoke yesterday, and instead of the kind of soaring rhetoric that we've seen in past convention speeches, of course, back in 2004, he was talking about, there's not a blue state and a red state, and he was talking in 2008 and 2012 about hope and change. Instead, this time, there's a very sombre warning about the peril facing the American Constitution and American democracy itself, and a pretty unprecedented condemnation of Donald Trump.
I never expected that my successor would embrace my vision or continue my policies. I did hope, for the sake of our country, that Donald Trump might show some interest in taking the job seriously, that he might come to feel the weight of the office and discover some reverence for the democracy that had been placed in his care. But he never did. For close to 4 years now, he has shown no interest in putting in the work, no interest in finding common ground, no interest in using the awesome power of his office to help anyone but himself and his friends. No interest in treating the presidency as anything but one more reality show that he can use to get the attention he craves.
Now, what was remarkable to me about that, Chaz, is because, yes, we get used to political rhetoric and attacks on Trump and his unfitness for office. We've heard it from former administration officials like John Bolton and others. Usually, ex-presidents, when they cast judgment on their successors, they'll say, they promised us this, they didn't deliver that, we all had high hopes, they haven't been able to deliver. Essentially, what Barack Obama said, what Michelle Obama said, what both of the Clintons said was, look, we hoped once this guy became president that he would rise to the task. Unfortunately, he has not been able to do it. He doesn't have it in him. And in the case of Barack Obama, saying he doesn't take it seriously, and yet all the time he's lining the pockets of his cronies and undermining the Constitution. arguing that a president is undermining the Constitution, damaging American democracy, it's a pretty historic rebuke. It reminded me of when Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s warned of the military-industrial complex. There are very few moments when presidents say things that echo down through the ages. And I wouldn't be surprised if Barack Obama's characterisation of Donald Trump, whatever happens in November, is going to be one of those things that is long remembered.
It's certainly a first. I can't remember a president being that strident against a successor. Personally, I don't have a great love for that particular precedent, so I don't care that it goes. But yeah, I could see people saying, you say Trump's a norm breaker, that breaks some norms right there. But I do think, I think you're right. It echoed what the Clintons said during their speeches, echoed Michelle Obama. I think her quote was, he simply cannot be who we need him to be for us. It is what it is. And then Bloomberg today said something like, he's not bad. I'm not saying he's a bad guy, I'm saying he's done a bad job. I think that kind of critique is an effective critique, much better than saying, oh, he's a dictator, he's evil, whatever.
Well, that not a bad guy has done a bad job, to me, is a more traditional criticism of an incumbent. It's what Mitt Romney tried to use against Obama in 2012.
Yeah.
It's to provide a permission structure for people that voted for Trump, or Obama in the case of 2012, to say, don't feel stupid that you voted for this guy. I get why you voted for this guy 4 years ago, but it just hasn't worked out. We thought it could work, just crazy enough to work. Well, turns out not so much.
What I found interesting, and I have no idea why this is the case, you might be able to jump in and tell me, is that for the first 3 days of this convention, that was the tone of the critiques. But then today, there were some critiques that were much harsher. There was Tammy Duckworth calling Trump the coward in chief. There was John Meacham, a historian of all people, saying that you need to vote for Biden to save the soul of America. There were some very harsh critiques today on the prime time day. I'm not quite sure why they chose it for today rather than any other time. But it was interesting that they were much more gentle until today.
There's a very deliberate structure to any convention, and this one, because it was conducted in just 2-hour made-for-TV blocks each night in prime time in the United States, only the second hour of which was being shown on network television, the 2 hours were being shown on the cable news channels. Essentially, it unfolds. There are broad themes. They cover particular issues on each day, but essentially you are mounting a prosecution case. And all of these speeches, particularly in this more intimate style rather than speechifying from a dais or a podium, they were witnesses for the prosecution, building a case as to why this hasn't worked out, and then the closing argument comes on day 4, culminating in the nominee's speech. What was interesting though, because of course Donald Trump has been watching this and hate tweeting about it all week, when he was asked about what he thought of that rebuke from Barack Obama, it was pretty interesting because he basically blamed Obama for making Trump president. Take a look.
Now, President Obama did not do a good job, and the reason I'm here is because of President Obama and Joe Biden. Because if they did a good job, I wouldn't be here. And probably if they did a good job, I wouldn't have even run. I would have been very happy. I enjoyed my previous life very much. But they did such a bad job that I stand before you as president.
So yet another example of Donald Trump saying the sort of quiet part out loud. It's like, I had a great life. I wouldn't have even run for president, except those guys were so terrible, so I thought I'd better run. Interesting sort of a formulation. Then, of course, yesterday, Kamala Harris formally accepted her party's vice presidential nomination, becoming just the 3rd woman and the first woman of colour on a major party's presidential ticket. She acknowledged that particular bit of history and the women that paved the way for her, including her own mother. Then she issued something of a rallying cry.
In this election, we have a chance to change the course of history. We're all in this fight. You, me, and Joe, together. What an awesome responsibility. What an awesome privilege. So let's fight with conviction. Let's fight with hope. Let's fight with confidence in ourselves and a commitment to each other, to the America we know is possible, the America we love.
a strong speech and a historic moment, although of all the speeches during the week, it was the one that felt as though it was eerily silent because it wasn't necessarily calibrated for the lack of an audience. That was one of those ones where I really felt that there wasn't a crowd there and it was written and delivered in such a way there should have been.
Yeah, she kept on pausing for applause that was not going to come.
Yeah, exactly.
The thing which I find most interesting about this convention overall, if I could generalise, is that I think you can really see in a way that people might not have expected Joe Biden putting his imprint on the party, or at least on the convention. Because the convention is, most people don't watch these conventions. If they do, they forget them immediately. The biggest use of a convention is telling activists what is our message for the next 3 months. And what was the message? It was character. The whole convention was about character. There was almost no policy at all. In fact, the only time in the entire 8 hours I saw anyone detail any policy was Joe Biden today about COVID for about 2 minutes. And that was it. So that was a very Biden touch as well. So very little policy. Lots of talk of crossing the aisle. I was telling you on Wednesday about all of us. That continued on day 3 and day 4. Lots and lots of all of us, all of us. The parade of Republicans just never seemed to stop. There was a guy there, wasn't it, Michael from Rhode Island, who I think was there for all 4 nights they showed him, at least 3 of the 4 nights. And they were obsessed with Republicans. In fact, some would say that this was the kind of ad that Democrats should have been running.
Democrats give a voice to the voiceless.
Because of the minority communities, I am very much alive because of you.
We fight for equality.
We're going to use every tool at our disposal to take on these inequities.
Elect leaders who stand with the underdog.
She is, quote, a fearless fighter for the little guy.
And at this week's Democratic convention, we finally gave a voice to the minority closest to our hearts, Republicans.
I'm proud of my Republican heritage.
And lifelong Republicans.
Lifelong Republican.
Republican. A lifelong Republican.
CEO Republicans.
I'm a longtime Republican and a longtime CEO.
Personal friend of Donald Trump Republicans.
I'm a former Republican member of Congress from New York City, and I've known Donald Trump for most of my political career.
And of course, Republican children of Republicans who were also children of Republicans.
I'm a lifelong Republican. My parents were introduced at a Republican National Convention by their parents. That's how far back it goes.
Now that's a Republican. The Democratic National Convention. A voice for the voiceless Republicans.
It's not just the Republicans. Then you look at who are the people who spoke just before Joe Biden. Buttigieg, Bloomberg, and then, of all people, Hunter Biden. He embraced Hunter in the end. I'm sure some Republicans would have thought he'd be trying to hide from Hunter, but no, he said, stuff you. This is my family. I'm embracing them. And I thought you really got the sense of Joe Biden didn't care what Sanders has to say or AOC or the Republicans. He wanted the convention his way. And I got that vibe.
I would go further and to say that this showed to me that Joe Biden is confident with Bernie Sanders' full-throated endorsement and the task forces they set up to examine policies and to find mutually agreeable positions between centrist Democrats and progressive Sanders Democrats. He feels as though Bernie and his supporters are now on board, which is why he spent so much more time reaching out through the likes of John Kasich and other never-Trump Republicans to try and at least get the independents, if not too many people that are self-identifying still as Republicans to this day. So that, to me, showed a certain sign of confidence with Biden, but also, you're right, it fits into bipartisan Biden narrative, that he is the guy that can reach across the aisle. So there was a consistency. Everything about this sort of 4-day period seemed to absolutely be tailored to who Joe Biden is and who we know him to be.
And the last thing I'd say is what I found fascinating is watching this new format develop. Because there were times when they just got it completely wrong. Like, for instance, yesterday, after Kamala Harris's speech, they were waving to an empty crowd. Have a look at this. I'll just talk over it as you look. They were waving and pointing at nobody. There was an empty auditorium that they were pointing at like they do in the normal speech. They had no idea how to react after the speech. But at the same time, they were feeling their way with new formats. Like, for instance, today, the primary candidates all had this chat. There wasn't the awkward Joe Biden interviewing people format, which is we've seen a few times. They all just had a chat, and it worked really well. And they've had some just normal people showcasing, like Adi Barkan, like who has ALS, about healthcare. And the way they've been showcasing normal people and just having just normal chats, I feel like that may be the way forward in future.
It may well be, and certainly it did make the non-speech moments more memorable and the speech moments less memorable. Where it lost its power was in Kamala Harris and Joe Biden's speeches as well, not having the enthusiasm of 25,000 party faithful. Maybe it's just because we're so used to those speeches. We've been conditioned for them. But I think we could certainly say that a lot more of future conventions will be taken offline and there'll be very few of those big speeches, but they'll be glad to have some big crowds back for those speeches so that they're not just pointing and waving at Delaware signs in the back of the room like that. And now to our guest this week, the former chairman of the Democratic Party, 5-term governor of Vermont and one-time presidential candidate, Howard Dean. Governor, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat.
Nice to be back.
When we last spoke 6 months ago, at that point, it looked as though Bernie Sanders, not Joe Biden, had the better chance of becoming the Democratic nominee this week. Could you have possibly guessed at the turn of events that we saw in that primary?
Well, I certainly didn't guess it, but looking back, it makes a lot of sense. I think what happened after the COVID epidemic started, which was right around the time the turn after Biden had taken South Carolina, I think people just got really worried, very, very worried. And we'd had 4 years of bombast and upheaval and all these kind of things. And I think although Bernie is an honest person, which differentiates him from Trump substantially, he was clearly going to take a point of view. He was clearly going to be a polarizing figure. And I think people just had enough of that. And that's why the move to Biden, I was as surprised as anybody else. I wasn't surprised that Biden won in South Carolina. That was expected. What I was shocked at was the next 2 weeks where Biden overwhelmed Bernie in the caucuses and the primaries.
Would you actually go so far as to say that without the pandemic, Joe Biden would not be your nominee?
That's quite possible. Nobody, of course, is ever going to know that. That's what we call that in hockey: woulda, shoulda, coulda.
As for the convention itself that we've seen this week, is the party missing out on something by not having the excitement and the hoopla that these conventions usually generate?
I don't think it does. I think you're going to see this. I think you're going to see somewhat of a permanent change. I don't think we'll abandon the format that we would have had, but I think we'll only have 2 days of it. This was happening anyway. The younger generation has taken over our party, and they're running things their way. They get out the votes their way. They talk to constituents their way. And so I think some kind of electronic evolution was inevitable, and it was just terribly accelerated by COVID. It is a good thing for us to have the conventions and get everybody together. There's 25,000 activists all meeting each other from around the country. But it's expensive, sometimes well beyond the means of most delegates. It's chaotic. It's a tremendous amount of money to spend. And so I actually think that, like many other things, the airline industry, higher education, commercial real estate, these are some changes that are not going to go back after the COVID virus goes away or becomes less problematic.
4 years ago, of course, there was still quite a show of disunity from Bernie Sanders supporters, very unhappy at the way that they felt that Bernie had been robbed of the nomination by Hillary Clinton. Having this virtual convention and giving Bernie Sanders a pretty central role in the speeches, has that papered over the cracks, do you think? Has this taken some of that pressure off?
There are differences, but there's so much motivation to get rid of Trump. Trump is totally incompetent and he's corrupt. He's probably the most corrupt president we've ever had. It's just shocking what he's been doing. And I think there's an enormous appetite to get rid of him, and not just among Democrats. We're having John Kasich, a former Republican governor who was a presidential candidate, come to speak to our convention. So there's a huge feeling that Trump has really done America wrong, and that unites us. Yes, there'll be arguments after this is over, and hopefully after Joe Biden becomes president, about how much to reform healthcare and so forth and so on. But I think we're all willing to put those aside, because if we don't get rid of Trump, there may not be a democracy in America 8 months from now.
And Governor, heading into the final stretch now, how confident are you feeling about Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's chances, given that Biden is basically in the same position now in the polls against Trump as Hillary Clinton was 4 years ago?
Well, I don't believe that you should ever be confident. I think you ought to run like you're 20 yards behind. So I don't sit around being confident. I sit around thinking how we're going to win, and I think that's what the stance we all have to take.
So what would you say would be the best way to win this sort of heavily constrained, socially distant campaign? There's not going to be a lot of baby kissing and handshaking and glad handing, or even knocking on doors.
Well, it may be that you don't need that. The door knocking is important. We want to get back to that as soon as COVID permits. But there's been a pretty effective campaign so far on Facebook and all these other electronic ways of doing things. A lot of phone calls, a lot of email, a lot of texts and so forth. So I think we are getting our message out. Biden has been incredibly effective getting his message out because he's been very steady about it. I'm a decent human being who's been in politics a long time. I'll steer a steady ship, and I'm an honest, decent guy. And there's a huge market for that after 4 years of Trump.
For months, of course, President Trump has been making allegations about the possibility of widespread voter fraud, particularly relating to mail-in ballots. What are the dangers there for Democrats, do you think?
I'm not very worried about this. I think the count won't probably come in. Trump will bray and horn on about how the election was illegal and the votes will be counted. The votes are counted by the state, not by the federal government. There'll be court suits, there'll be a scene, and Biden will win. January 20th at noon, Trump will no longer be president of the United States.
And Governor, what would your advice be for Joe Biden from this point? How does he turn what is a solid poll lead that has been pretty consistent this year into a win in November?
He needs to do exactly what he's doing. His campaign message, this is what Bill Clinton used to call the meta message. Joe Biden's meta message is that he's a decent person who's worked very hard for this country, undergone particularly a terrible amount of sacrifices on his own, and he wants to help the United States of America, and he's not going to be flamboyant and outrageous and rise to every Trump accusation. He's just going to be steady as it goes, and that is exactly what the American people want right now. I think the campaign he's running is really, really good because it's about who he is as a human being.
Governor Howard Dean, great to talk to you. Thanks for being with us on the Fireside Chat.
Thanks very much for having me on.
Oh, and by the way, Chaz, a lot of people online are still confused about how exactly to say Kamala Harris's first name.
Why is Kamala Harris not listening to you?
California Senator Kamala Harris.
I want to play a little bit more of what Kamala Harris said today.
Many different interpretations of it. There is an ad, though, that she ran in 2016 when she was running for US Senate in California. Take a look.
It's not Kamala. It's not Kamala. It's not Kamala.
It's Kamala.
Kamala Harris.
I'm Kamala Harris, and I approve this message.
So, it's Kamala Harris, like instant karma or karma chameleon Harris, but with a la on the end. Equal emphasis on all three syllables, whereas Australians like to go, Kamala or Kamala, etc., etc. But also confusing for Australian accents, she provided this bit of guidance.
Will you pronounce your name for me, please?
It's Kamala.
Kamala.
Yeah, just think of like a comma and add a la.
Okay.
Which had a lot of people going, hang on, Kamala. Now, of course, that comes down to the different way that Americans pronounce their vowels to Australians. It's not Kamala, it is Kamala. So it's like, we call it Craigslist here, but in the US they call it Craigslist.
Gotcha.
And there's the whole Colin Powell and the whole Kofi Annan thing and everything else.
Okay.
So ignore the Kamala thing, because a lot of people on Twitter were going, no, she said it's Kamala. No, Kamala.
Okay, all right. Well, look, either way, her rollout's been pretty successful. There was a poll just the other day from Latino Decisions that found that Biden's approval went from 59 to 26 to 65 to 17 amongst Latinos as soon as he introduced Kamala Harris to the picture. And he got an 11-point boost amongst African Americans. So, at least in the short term, that worked. The question is, though, she might be the beginning of a whole new range of politicians that look a different way to the politicians of the past. But where are they? Because they might not be quite so apparent as you think. I recorded a wall about this. Have a look.
Big, beautiful world.
People have gotten pretty excited this week about the first female African-American candidate for vice president.
Kamala Harris is not an African-American. She is Indian and Jamaican.
Can we not do this, please? Fine. The first black female candidate for vice president. Is that okay? The problem, though, is that the cupboard is pretty bare for diverse representation at the moment. Harris's two runner-ups were apparently a woman who has never even run for public office and a woman whose name you've already forgotten. So how is America looking for the next generation of candidates? Well, There are a record number of women running for the House this year, about 29% of all candidates, even more than in 2018, which was at the time a big record. And encouragingly, Republicans have improved even more this year than the Democrats have. Now, those are the women running in the primaries, but do they actually win primaries? Yes, they do. With 90% of the House races having been held so far, about 35% of races have been won by women. So women are actually outperforming compared to who's running. And if we split it up along party lines, you can see that Republican women win nominations at about the same rate as they run for nominations, about 21%. But Democrats, they really like voting for women, especially lately. Whoa, 47% of the winning Democratic nominees this year have been women. Of course, these nominees include a lot of incumbents who would mostly be men. So if we just look at the new nominees, about 30%-ish of Republican non-incumbent nominees are women, and about 60% of Democratic non-incumbent nominees are women. So change is happening, at least in the House it is. Not quite so much change in the Senate, with about 23% of candidates being women. That's not fantastic, although about 30% of primary winners are women, and about 40% of Democratic primary winners are women. So, what about racial minorities? Generally speaking, there's progress being made there. For the first 22 state primaries, over 30% of House candidates were from a racial minority compared to about 40% of the population. That compares to only 22% 2 years ago. And once again, there are more Democratic minorities than Republican minorities. Well, look at that, 42% of Democrat candidates were from a racial minority. That's more than the general population. But this is about Kamala Harris after all, so what about black women? Well, bearing in mind that black women only make up about 6.5% of the population, the share of candidates that are black women isn't too shabby. Republicans, not great, but Democrats make up for it, and overall, we're not far off the population share. As for the Senate, a teeny bit worse, but that's not too bad. Although, these are the black women who ran in a primary. The number of black women who won a Senate primary equals 0. So, if the Democrats win the election, the Senate may revert to having 0 black women. That might be a concern, but what about Hispanic women? Now, there are more of them than black women, over 8% of the population, yet their House representation is worse, a lot worse. Only about 3.5% of candidates were Hispanic women. And as for the Senate, well, that is very not good. About 1% of Senate candidates were Hispanic women. So don't forget them while we're focusing on breakthroughs for
Indian
African
and Jamaican.
No!
Big, beautiful world.
I love how you just keep appearing in different parts of the studio. It's pretty amazing. There are now exactly 75 days until the US presidential election, and Joe Biden's lead in the average of polls has remained pretty steady this week. After a half-point spike following the announcement of his running mate last week, Biden just over 7.5 points in front. Too early to see if there will be any kind of a convention bounce yet. There has been a $90 million surge in donations, though. Here is the state of the race for you. Feed the average of state polls into the Electoral College calculator. If an election had been held this week, everybody would have been a little bit surprised. But still, Joe Biden would have won with 337 Electoral College votes to President Trump's 201. And that does mean that North Carolina has swung back into the president's column, so he is making up for a little bit of lost ground, but still a long way from the 270 Electoral College votes he would need to win a second term. According to 538's election model, Joe Biden still has a 72% chance of winning the White House, while the Economist's forecast model is more bullish on Joe Biden, giving him an 87% chance of winning. But now, And Chaz, there has been a little bit else going on this week. President Trump's 2016 campaign manager, Steve Bannon, he's in all kinds of trouble.
And we have breaking news. Former White House advisor Steve Bannon was arrested this morning on charges he defrauded donors in an online fundraising campaign to pay for the border wall.
Now, it is alleged, Chaz, that Steve Bannon allegedly told donors to this charity he wouldn't take a dime from this border wall charity that he'd set up. He and 3 others are now accused of taking more than a dime, taking about $1 million between them. So he's under arrest. Also this week, President Trump was asked by reporters about the shady far-right conspiracy theorists and racists who call themselves QAnon.
I've heard these are people that love our country and they just don't like seeing it. So I don't know really anything about it other than they do supposedly like me.
Now, of course, QAnon are some of the same people who peddled claims that Hillary Clinton was running a pedophile ring out of a non-existent basement in a very real pizza parlor in Washington. That led one man with a gun to turn up and try and free the kids. They've also promoted conspiracy theories around the killing of DNC staffer Seth Rich. So reporters tried to fill the president in a bit on all of that.
At the crux of the theory is this belief that you are secretly saving the world from this satanic cult of pedophiles and cannibals. Does that sound like something you are behind? Or
Well, I haven't heard that, but is that supposed to be a bad thing or a good thing? I mean, you know, if I can help save the world from problems, I'm willing to do it. I'm willing to put myself out there. And we are, actually. We're saving the world from a radical left philosophy that will destroy this country. And when this country is gone, the rest of the world would follow.
Don't do that.
Yet again, President Trump says the exact opposite of what any normal politician, much less a president, would say. When told that satanic conspiracy theorists talking about pedophiles, they would just say, well, obviously I don't agree with these people, I don't support these people. No, instead, in those comments that are very reminiscent of the very fine people comments about those tiki torch carrying neo-Nazis in Charlottesville, he will not condemn anybody who says they like him. The same tendency which John Bolton and others have said, this is what is exploited by dictators and despots. And probably the reason why Steve Bannon is just the latest in a long line of former associates who've now been charged and in many cases convicted of crimes committed in the orbit of Donald Trump. It's pretty remarkable stuff.
He doesn't need to condemn them, just tell them they're wrong. Like, honestly, it seems funny to us, but this is a cult that splits up families.
Yeah.
There are families being split up because of that answer. Just tell them they're wrong. Anyway, quick update on the COVID figures before we go, John. Over 5.5 million cases in total now, although the new cases are now down to the mid 40,000s per day. Over 175,000 total deaths, with still about 1,000 new deaths a day. And that might be an underestimate, because plenty of deaths fall through the cracks. Homeless people, people dying in their homes without going to hospital, people dying before they can get tested. The New York Times has been tracking the excess deaths compared to the usual deaths for this time of year. This is their latest results. From March to the end of July, there have been more than 57,000 deaths than usual in the South. 95,000 more deaths than usual in the Northeast, 219,000 more deaths than usual across America for that time period. So that might not be the precise number of COVID deaths, but it does suggest the real number of COVID deaths could be already over 200,000 potentially. Another measure you might not have seen is the change in employment since January. Those who earn more than $32 an hour have actually increased their employment levels since then. But as you get lower paid, the employment levels reduce till we get to those who earn $14 an hour. They have 20% less employment than they did in January. Finally, the effect on kids. All that online learning, it takes a toll, but not on everyone. Overall maths coursework results have dropped about 3% from January to May, but high-income kids have actually increased their results by 45% during that time period with their tutoring and their one-on-one care. It's the low-income kids whose results have dropped by 36%. And that is just one reason everyone's very keen to get those kids back to school. By the way, before we go, we really should note, since we spoke last week about how dodgy the Steele dossier was, but we shouldn't confuse the Steele dossier or the surveillance warrants for Carter Page with the broader Russia investigation that they were part of, because that was most definitely not a hoax. The Senate released a report this week about that with even more details than were in the Mueller report, and some of them are very interesting indeed, John, but we're out of time, so I'll tell you about that in a brand new Pet podcast right there. See you then.
And on that note, that is it for another Fireside Chat. We'll be back on Planet America next Wednesday night at 9:30 p.m. This week's show as well is on iView if you missed it, including our chat with Michael Dukakis.
Don't forget the podcast. See you there.
Bye-bye.